Welcome to Reading with Ryan. On today's episode, our fifth in our Ramadan Reading Reflections series, we're going to look at a book that has had an immense impact on not just my own personal and spiritual journey to Islam, but on those of many of my friends and colleagues. This is And Muhammad is His Messenger by the late, great Annemarie Schimmel. Professor Schimmel taught at Harvard University for over 30 years as the chief professor of Indo-Islamic Studies. Her books include Mystical Dimensions of Islam, Islam in the Indian Subcontinent, Gabriel's Wing, a study into the religious ideas of Sir Muhammad Iqbal, and Calligraphy and Islamic Culture. In total, she is the author of 12 books. Dr. Schimmel completed her PhD at the age of 16 in Germany. She was someone who, from the accounts of those who knew her, including several professors that I've been fortunate to study under, she was fluent and conversant in over 10 languages, besides her native German, as well as English, French, Italian, Latin, Greek, and, for Oriental languages, Arabic, Persian. I use the term Oriental here deliberately in terms of Orientalist as a positive term rather than a negative term, Sindhi, and also Hindi. Professor Schimmel was someone who inspired many of those that she met, not only with her erudition, but her incredible attention to memory. She was able to have conversations with 3 or 4 people at once in 3 or 4 different languages. This is something that I have heard from 3 separate professors who knew her and had worked with her over many years. This book was written in 1984 when she was at Cambridge at Harvard, and it was published by the University of North Carolina Press at Chapel Hill in 1985. Professor Schimmel passed away at the age of 80 in 2003 and leaves behind today many first and second generation students of hers. This book's subtitle, The Veneration of the Prophet in Islamic Piety, is very important to me on a personal level because this is one of the first books I read after Martin Ling's biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and it was a book that really began to unveil for me the depth and breadth and scope of the character of the Prophet, not only in the earliest Islamic sources that have survived in the historical record, which date to about 150 to 300 years after his death, in 632 of the Common Era, or after Christ, but specifically the role that the Prophet played and continues to play in Islamic piety. Now, this is something that is very obvious to Muslims, but to non-Muslims, they're often unaware of this. What's very interesting is that Professor Schimmel begins the book with a beautiful Persian poem, which she translates into English as follows. Be I infidel or true believer, God alone knows what I am, but I know I am the Prophet's servant, who Medina's ruler is. Sir Kishan Prasad Shad, Hindu Prime Minister of Hyderabad state. This gives you a sense of the enduring appeal of the Prophet as a figure who was venerated by non-Muslims, including eminent non-Muslims, in what we would call Indo-Islamic history, the history of Islamic influence in India, and of course its dialogues with various representatives from different branches of Sanatan Dharma, or what later on is called Hinduism. I'll read you the preface. This book is the fruit of an interest in the figure of the Prophet of Islam that has developed over more than 4 decades. I was first introduced to and deeply moved by the concept of the mystical Muhammad when I was a teenager, busying myself with the study of Arabic under the guidance of Dr. Hans Ellenberg. I'll just make a note here. Professor Schimmel wrote her first book at the age of 9. Yes, 9. During these formative years, the books of Sir Syed Amir Ali, The Life and Teachings of Muhammad, or The Spirit of Islam, and Tor Andre's masterful study, Die Person Muhammads in Lehre und Glaube seiner Gemeinde, were among my favorites. and André's book remains a source of inspiration to this day. During my student days at Berlin University, I enjoyed reading Suleiman Chalebi's Mevlud-i-Sharif, a simple, touching poem that tells of the miracles at Muhammad's birth in images very similar to popular Christian Christmas carols. But little did I know then that I would attend many Mevlut in the 5 years I spent in Turkey as professor of comparative religion in the Islamic Faculty of Theology in Ankara. In that period, I learned much about the popular veneration of the Prophet among Turkish Muslims. A deepening interest in the poetical and mystical literature of the Indo-Pakistani subcontinent then led me to realize how much love of the Prophet had colored the work of Sir Muhammad Iqbal, the poet-philosopher of this century. She's writing, of course, in 1984. The study of Sindhi folk literature added new facets to the picture. My fascination with the development of the veneration of the Prophet and its reflection in literature, especially poetry, resulted in a number of articles pertaining to prophetology as perceived by Iqbal, reflected in Sindhi poetry, and theoreticized by a reformist Muslim mystic like Mir Dard in 18th century Delhi, and other topics. The material thus collected and combined with that culled from other sources formed the basis of one of the lectures I delivered in 1980 to the American Council of Learned Societies, published as Chapter 5 of my book, As Through a Veil. That's another beautiful book of Dr. Schimmel's that I would heartily recommend. I have it just behind me. My German publisher, Ulf Dietrichs, then encouraged me to enlarge that chapter into a book about the veneration of the Prophet, which appeared in 1981. It is this book that is offered here to Anglophone readers, but in a form that has outgrown the space limits of the German edition. We have also omitted the illustrations from that edition here, for although they belong to the medieval Islamic tradition, modern Muslims tend to be offended by representations of the Prophet other than the verbal description. This is something I'll comment very briefly, that while perhaps the majority of Muslims would indeed be offended by visual descriptions of the Prophet, it's worth noting, as a matter of academic record and historical fact, that images of the Prophet in portraiture and illustrated paintings were actually quite common, at least among elite circles in the Persianate, Turkish, and also Arabic worlds in the medieval period. I have a book that I will show perhaps later on, which is by Oleg Rabar, who was at the Met for many, many years, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And this is called Masterpieces of Islamic Art in Miniature Portraiture. So what you find often today among the Sunni majority of Muslims is that among non-academics there may tend to be a reservation or even a strong dislike about the notion of visual depictions of prophets or indeed of any human beings in a religious or iconographical form. But Sayyid Hussein Nasr and others make the point that Islamic art should not be called iconoclastic so much as aniconic, meaning without the use of visual or figural representation of divine figures, in contrast, for instance, to Western and Eastern Christianity, or more properly, Catholic and Orthodox Christianity on one hand, or most schools of Hinduism on the other, which do have a very rich and varied tradition of iconographical use and depiction. I would posit, though, that while indeed in masajid, in mosques, one does not see images of the prophets or the imams or the saints as a general rule in the Sunni world, in the Shia world this is something that one does find, at least on a devotional level, although again in the use of actual congregational worship spaces, figure representation is generally avoided even among Shia Muslims. So that is a distinction I would just make briefly there. Many people have had their share in the growth of this book. Qawwals in India and Pakistan who sang the praise of the Prophet in unforgettable tunes, theologians who sometimes objected to the mystical interpretation of the person of the Messenger of God, old women in the villages of Turkey and Pakistan whose whole life was permeated by a deep trusting love of the beloved of God. This is a rendering into English of one of the Prophet's most important titles, if not his most important title, Habiballah, which means both beloved of God and lover of God. And students both in the Islamic countries and in the United States who asked questions and tried to learn more about a phenomenon that is so little known in the West. And thus, going into the beginning of the book, I'll skip the introduction, other than several brief references to it. It's essentially a historiographical overview of the literature in German, Dr. Schimmel's original language and first language, and English and French, of modern or early modern and then modern biographical and hagiographical works about the Prophet. And the main contribution of this section is to make a clear distinction, as she does early on, between the hagiographical and the historical biographical literature. And she makes the point that for the vast majority of early Muslim sources, there is a blending of the two. This is a phenomenon that is not unique to Islamic depictions of the Prophet, compared to, say, Christian depictions of Christ, Buddhist depictions of the Buddha, Hindu depictions of various figures that are considered to be demigods or gods or avatars. So she makes the point that in early modern and pre-modern periods specifically, what we'd say is the classical, post-classical, and the early medieval periods of the world religions, one finds that hagiography, or works of pious nature that seek to, above all, help the listener or the reader. Of course, the readers were a small minority. Most people were listening to these texts being recited, get closer to God. The biographical aspect, kind of a strict historical, critical, biographical approach, is much more of a recent modern phenomenon in all religious traditions. So she makes that point early on. Then going to the next chapter. I mean, there's so much in here. This is, again, a book that deeply moved me. But I wanted to briefly touch on her third chapter, or second chapter, including the preface, Muhammad, the Beautiful Model. And this is a really important chapter, I think, for non-Muslims to grasp a sense of the magnitude and immensity of the Prophet's importance for Muslims as not just, let's say, the historic founder of their religion so many 1,400 years ago, but someone whose example and tradition and want, W-O-N-T, his manner, his way, his approach, and all these terms in English are rendered into one Arabic term, sunnah. His sunnah, both for Sunnis who take their name from this term, and for Shia Muslims, his sunnah, although there are some differences in approach between Sunnis and Shias, they have a common love for what they believe to be his sunnah, his particular tradition and example, to the point that all Muslims, regardless of their sectarian identity, look to him as their chief moral exemplar in every aspect of human endeavor, if they're practicing Muslims. One must always keep in mind that Muhammad never claimed to possess any superhuman qualities. Now that actually is debated, of course, among Muslim intellectuals as well as perhaps lay Muslims who might disagree with that. But let's continue just for now. He was and wanted to remain, quote, a servant to whom revelation has come. She's quoting here from Surah 41:5. And when he was challenged by the Meccans to perform miracles, he used to say that the only miracle in his life was that he had received the divine revelation in clear Arabic language, which was proclaimed through him as the inimitable Quran. He knew that he was only a mediator, and when his compatriots asked him to substantiate his message by performing miracles, it was revealed to him, say, if men and jinn would unite to bring something like the Quran, they could not bring it even if they would support each other. That's Surah 1790. Also Surah 637. As eloquent as the Arabs might be, and as perfect as their highly refined traditional poetry might be, even they would not be able to produce a single sentence that could be compared in form and content to the Quran. This central position of the Quran in the Islamic Heilsgeschichte stands phenomenologically parallel to the position of Christ in Christianity. Christ is the divine word incarnate. The Quran is, to use Harry Wolfson's apt term, the divine word in libret, in book form. It is therefore these two manifestations of the divine word that should be compared, for neither in theological nor in phenomenological terms can Muhammad be likened to the Christ of Christianity. Hence the Muslim aversion to the term Mohammedans. This was an old Western term to describe Muslims, which seems to them to imply a false parallel to the concept of Christians as followers of or worshippers of Christ. Muhammadi, as in the Mohammedan path, is used in specific connections, usually by mystics who try to emulate the Prophet's example even more than others. As a medieval mystic, Shamsi Tabrizi said, "A Muhammadi is he who has a broken heart, who has reached the heart, and can utter the An al-Haqqi Muhammadi, the Muhammadan, I am the truth," which is An al-Haq in Arabic. It's a phrase that got Mansur al-Hallaj into quite a bit of trouble. Muhammad knew and was repeatedly reminded by the Quranic revelation that he was only a human being, a man whose only prerogative was that he was granted a revelatory experience. As Surah 6:50 admonishes him, "Say, I do not say, with me are the treasures of God, and I do not know the invisible, and I do not say that I am an angel. I follow only that which is revealed to me." He was also reminded that only the Lord was able to guide mankind. The Quran here is addressing Muhammad. You cannot guide on the right path whom you want. It is God who guides. Surah 28:56. What had been revealed to him is that, quote, your God is one God. Surah 37:4. And thus he was called, Muhammad was called, to preach the message of uncompromising monotheism, or tawheed, of absolute surrender to the one God who is creator, sustainer, and judge. Muhammad felt that whatever happened to him was nothing but God's inexplicable grace, which he did not deserve, and which had elected him as its vessel. For God admonished him, "Verily, if we wanted, we would take away what we have revealed to you, and then you would not find for yourself a defendant against us." Surah 17:88. He knew that he could never have hoped that such a Quran would be given to him, quote, "save by the mercy of your Lord." Surah 28:86. And when the Meccans, his own people, his hometown, ridiculed him, asking persistently when the hour of judgment would arrive, an hour of whose horrors he had been speaking in such terrifying words to them, he had to repeat again that he too was not informed about its arrival, that he was nothing but, quote, an evident warner. Surah 29:49, awakening the hearts of those who are in fear of this hour. Surah 20:15, and others. Yet there are some passages in the Quran that point to Muhammad's exceptional role. As God, quote, taught Adam the names, Surah 2:30, thus he taught Muhammad the Quran, Surah 96:3. For Muhammad was sent, quote, as a mercy for the worlds. This is a very important title from the Quran, Rahmatan lil Alameen in Arabic, Surah 21:107. And God and his angels, in the Quran, it says, utter blessings upon him, Surah 33:56. He is, quote, verily of noble nature, Surah 68:4. In several places one finds the divine command, together, obey God and obey his messenger, or similar formulations, so that the prophetic authority is paired with the divine authority, immediately subordinate to it or emanating from it, but that they're twain, they're together. Such Quranic sentences formed the basis of a veneration of Muhammad that soon far surpassed the respect normally accorded to a mere prophet, and even now the pious Muslim will never mention anything belonging to or relating to the prophet without adding the attribute sharif, noble, or Sayyid or Sayyidina, for instance. So you may notice I don't do that, and that's primarily because I'm speaking in an academic discourse, primarily to non-Muslims as well as Muslims. But for non-Muslims who are not familiar with this, it can be quite jarring. When I was not yet a Muslim, I found it quite overwhelming because, for instance, the norm is to repeat certain honorific terms in Arabic, or you can say them in English, when speaking of the Prophet or any other Prophet, or a family member or companion of the Prophet. And there are certain words in Arabic for how one does that, which of course those of us who know this tradition know full well. But I decided not to do that, not from a lack of respect, certainly not, but because it just sort of muddles the communication in English. And of course I'm using English here as a medium. In the course of time, then, short Quranic remarks were elaborated and spun out into long tales and wondrous legends, which slowly illuminated the outlines of the historical Muhammad with an array of color. Professor Schimmel is not criticizing this development, which is natural and organic in every religious tradition. The founding figure, the human founding figure, whoever he is, takes on truly legendary roles and really fills the entire possible domain of human, what I would call spiritual psychology. So the Prophet, whatever your ailment is, whatever your condition is, in the traditional Muslim world, there is a story, there is a tale, there are hadiths, there are sayings that have been codified in written traditions, originally based on oral transmission, that were recorded several centuries after he passed away, that have a very tremendous weight or authority in both the Islamic institutional culture as well as popular culture, and therefore folk piety, so popular piety. The obedience due to the Prophet seems to have played an important, perhaps the central role in the development of Islamic piety. Most obviously, the Prophet was the one who taught the first Muslims how to pray, what to pray, and how to pray. The Quran does not give that much in the way of detail for how to perform one's daily prayers, and so it is the prophetic tradition. He was their living guide. So he was their imam in all the prayers. I'm using the term imam here in a Sunni sense of someone who simply leads the prayer. And so he also was, in a Shia sense, the imam, in other words, the absolute leader of the community in every dimension, religiously, politically, socially. So the Prophet, all Muslims would agree, despite their differences, that the Prophet himself combined in his person the role of, from a Western perspective, let's say, king, pope, patriarch, judge, etc., all in his own person. Does not Surah 329 state, "Say, if you love God, follow me," meaning the Prophet, "then God will love you and forgive your sins. Verily God is forgiving, merciful." This is similarly mentioned in Surah 33, verse 30. In the bipartite profession of faith, or the Shahadatain in Arabic, when one says, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah, there is no deity save God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, the second half, which defines Islam as a distinctive religion, constitutes, as Wilfred Cantwell Smith rightly says, a statement about God in his activity in the world, rather than about the Prophet's person. For by sending his Prophet, who proclaims his word, God reveals himself to the world. The Prophet is, according to Nathan Soderblom, an aspect of God's activity. Muhammad is singled out by God. He is truly the chosen one, al-Mustafa. And for this reason, his sunnah, his way of life, became the uniquely valid rule of conduct for the Muslims. As the Prophet says, "Who follows me belongs to me, and who does not love my sunnah does not belong to me." For Muhammad is indeed, as the Quran states, an uswa hasana, a beautiful model, according to Surah 33:21. In the understanding of classical Islamic religious theory, Muhammad's sunnah consists of his actions, or fil, his words, qawl, and his silent approval of certain facts, taqrir. His well-attested way of behavior, or at least the way that was considered well enough attested to be historically true, attained a normative value for subsequent generations from at least as early as the 2nd century of Islam, meaning the late 7th century of the Common Era. Because of the importance of the Prophet's noble example, the science of hadith came gradually to occupy a central place in Islamic culture. Hadith, the word means narrative or tradition or saying, specifically a prophetic tradition. In Sunni Islam, hadiths are only of the Prophet Muhammad. In the Shia tradition, they include the Prophet and also the lineal descendants in his family, who are called the Ahl al-Bayt, or the people of the prophetic household. And also Sunnis and Shias look to different books, although many Muslims who are maybe less inclined to strictly follow one or the other may study both of them. But there's a lot of overlap in the content. So a hadith is a report that contains a remark about a saying or an action of the Prophet, as it is told by one of his trustworthy companions who related it to someone in the next generation. The Sahaba, Muhammad's companions, are thus the most important source for prophetic traditions. A hadith may treat a ritual problem, how to wash, how to break the fast, etc. It can discuss details of faith and doctrine, tell about punishment in the next world or reward, or simply describe the Prophet's behavior while eating, sleeping, or giving advice. To the chain of transmitters, the isnad, every generation added new members, until long lines of traditionalists developed, each link connected with the previous one in a well-established relationship. In the 3rd Islamic century, the 9th century of the Christian era, during which the most important canonical collections of hadith were compiled, a typical hadith looked something like this. A said, I heard B say that he had heard C telling D, who told him that E stated. F said that G transmitted, I have heard from Abu Hurairah, or so-and-so, that the Prophet did this or that. So it's sort of like a game of telephone, where something starts with A and ends with Z. I would describe it more as a kind of journalistic work than, strictly speaking, modern historical work. The compilations of hadith, both in the Sunni and Shia tradition, were not categorized formally until between 200 and 300 years after the death of the Prophet. But nonetheless, they provide, from a purely historical perspective, far and away the most detailed alleged sayings of a founding figure of any of the world's religions. We don't have nearly as much sayings attributed to Jesus or Moses or Krishna or Buddha or any of these other figures compared to the sayings that we have attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. One of the most important branches of scholarship was the examination of traditions, meaning hadith, supposed sayings, alleged sayings attributed to Muhammad, because they contained the exposition of the Prophet's behavior and thus formed the source for all aspects of correct human behavior. However, the scrutinization of hadith was primarily geared not toward the text of the tradition, but rather toward the reliability of the chain of traditionists by whom a certain text was transmitted. So here she gives a very detailed overview of that process, which is well worth reading, but for the sake of time, I'll move on to a different area. In every single language in the Islamic tradition, local and regional languages, praise poems called nasheeds or naats about the Prophet take on central importance. They're sung at informal gatherings of friends, at formal blessed occasions such as weddings, celebrations of births, engagements, public events in general, Thursday night gatherings, Mawlid events in honor of the Prophet's birthday, and so on. But also throughout the Islamic tradition, especially in the Turkic lands of the Ottoman, what used to be the Ottoman Empire in Turkey and much of the Middle East and Central Asia as well, you have a beautiful tradition called the Hilya, which is in calligraphic form representation of the Prophet's virtues. And These were often beautifully embossed, as one can see. This one is in the Nastaliq script, a Persianate script. The Ottomans used the Persian alphabet, and you can often see markers of identity in them. So here, the Ottomans were, they prided themselves as being Orthodox Sunnis. So you see in the four corners surrounding the central parts of the Hilya text, the name of the first four caliphs, who in the Sunni tradition are called the Khulafa Rashidun, or the four rightly guided caliphs. In contradistinction to this, a Shia version of a Hilya, popular in the Safavid, officially Shia Persian Empire, for instance, might have the names of the five members of the Ahl al-Kisa, the people of the cloak, which included the immediate members of some of the Prophet's family. Here's another one. So the one I just showed you was inscribed in 1830 by Yesadizadeh Mustafa Izzat. And here is another one from 1882 in traditional Naqsh calligraphic style by Ahmed Kamil Effendi. And this was what he actually composed in honor of his graduation. So when he received an official appointment, having completed his apprenticeship, and now he was authorized to teach others in his own path. And there was a long, long tradition of basically master to apprentice mentorship throughout the pre-modern world. Here is a beautiful poem from Qadi Iyad, one of the best representatives, according to Professor Schimmel, of the reverent admiration of the Prophet, so typical of Muslim piety. He writes as following, this is on page 46. God has elevated the dignity of his Prophet and granted him virtues, beautiful qualities, and special prerogatives. He has praised his high dignity so overwhelmingly that neither tongue nor pen are sufficient to describe him. In his book, meaning the Quran, he has clearly and openly demonstrated his high rank and praised him for his qualities of character and his noble habits. He asks his servants to attach themselves to him and to follow him obediently. It is God, great is his majesty, who grants honor and grace, who purifies and refines. He that lauds and praises and grants a perfect recompense. He places before our eyes his noble nature, meaning God places before our eyes the Prophet's noble nature, perfected and sublime in every respect. He grants him perfect virtue, praiseworthy qualities, noble habits, and numerous preferences, meaning in rank, high rank. He supports his message with radiant miracles, clear proofs, and apparent signs. All reports speak of Muhammad's friendly, kindly, but serious attitude, and point out that he did not often laugh. One famous prophetic tradition, frequently quoted by the early ascetics, or those who sought to withdraw from the world, say, "If you knew what I know, you would cry much and laugh little." This is referring to the Prophet's multiple visions of the torments of hell. However, he is also said to have had a most winning smile that never failed to enchant his followers, and Ghazali even mentions his tendency to laugh. So you see there is some contradicting notions here. Did he laugh a lot? Did he not laugh a lot? Muslims have debated this for 1,200 years or so, since these reports were put to writing. His soft-spoken humor is palpable from some early Islamic stories, such as the following. One day, a little old woman came to him to ask whether old, wretched women would also go to paradise. "No," answered the Prophet, "there are no old women in paradise." And then, looking at her grieved face, he continued on with a smile, "They will all be transformed in paradise, for there is only one youthful age for all." So she first thought he was saying, no, you don't have a place. He was saying that no one will be suffering from the effects of old age in paradise when the physical form has been left behind, the body is gone, and so with it all of its ailments. His practical wisdom in dealing with his companions is nicely revealed in his remark to Abu Huraira, who had the habit of visiting him too often, Zur khaban tazdid huban, in Farsi, visit rarely, then you'll be loved more. The sources praise Muhammad's concern for the weak, and his kindliness is always highlighted. He never beat one of his servants, nor a maidservant, and none of his wives, say the tradition. This is in contradistinction to the brutality of much of his contemporary Arab society. Among the non-Muslims, this was well attested that there was a lot of violence towards those of lower class, towards those who are physically weaker, such as children or women. And in contradistinction to this, the Prophet's example, his sunnah, literally, his life example here, was to show the greatest gentleness in his family life, in his exchange with anyone who was a social dependent or inferior, someone of weaker status or something like that. Tirmidhi describes him as follows: he was well acquainted with sorrow, much absorbed in thought, had little rest, was silent for long periods, and did not talk without cause. He began and finished his talk with the formula, in the name of God, Bismillah. His talk was pithy, neither too long, like this video, or too short, not coarse, but also not too playful or light. He honored each of God's signs of grace, even though it might be small, and never found blame in anything or anyone. Practical advice to his people is not lacking either. When a Bedouin asked him whether, since he trusted in God and his protection, he could let his camel roam loose, the Prophet answered briefly, Iqilha wa tawakkal. First tether it, first tie up the camel, and then trust in God. In today's language it would be, can I leave my car unlocked? Or can I just leave my car on neutral? First, park it, lock it, and trust in God. So this is the idea that, again, faith should be joined to practical works. You shouldn't just leave your intelligence, your mind, your aql at the door. The importance of activity in this world, as contrasted to an unhealthy fatalism that leads in the long run to a lack of responsibility, is expressed best in the oft-repeated hadith. This world is the seedbed for the next world. So you get there what you plant here. You reap what you sow. Every action upon which man embarks here will bring its fruits, good or bad, in the next world, at the day of resurrection. Furthermore, every faithful Muslim should be reminded to appropriate the Prophet's short prayer, O Lord, increase my knowledge. Another beautiful hadith relevant to this is that knowledge is the lost property of every Muslim, meaning Muslims have an obligation religiously to learn, to study. And that does not just mean religion, but general study. The devout should likewise imitate his way of dealing with his contemporaries and behavior in society. Was he not even blamed in the Quran, in Surah 80, verse 1, for frowning when a blind visitor interrupted him in an important conversation? This divine criticism led him to a well-balanced kindness toward everyone. When someone came with a request, he was not sent off before it had either been granted or before he had at least received a friendly word. The Prophet's friendliness and largesse, meaning his generosity, encompassed everyone. He was like a father for his companions. And she's quoting here from some of the earliest surviving primary Islamic sources. To illustrate such brief remarks, long and touching legends easily grow up over the centuries. Among them is one told by Rumi in his Mathnawi, his epic elegiac poem, which has been called the Persianized spirit of the Quran, or the spirit of the Quran rendered into Farsi verse. An infidel visited the Prophet, and as is the infidel's custom, he ate with 7 stomachs. Here it's a criticism in Islam, you're encouraged to not overeat. There's a hadith attributed to the Prophet that you should, when eating, basically follow a 3-part ratio of water, food, and air, breathing. After stuffing himself overmuch, he lay down in the guest room, where he soiled the linen, and leaving the room dirty, slipped out secretly before dawn. So this man ate too much, had an accident and, ashamed of himself, left before anyone could find out. However, he had to return to seek an amulet that he had forgotten in his room, and found the prophet washing the sullied linen with his own hands. Of course, he immediately became a Muslim, as the story goes, put to shame by such humility and generosity. Such stories cannot have been invented without any basis. They may go back to early historical nuclei, having been elaborated in later times to make the ideals of Muslim ascetic mystical circles conform with the historical example of the Prophet. Along these lines, Muhammad's poverty and the destitute situation of his family members form an essential theme of popular tradition. His bread, it is said, was made from unsifted barley, and some reports describe how he and his family, especially his beloved daughter Fatima, suffered from hunger many a night. In fact, the Prophet always fastened a stone on his stomach to try to suppress the feelings of hunger. And the misery of Fatima has been told in heartrending stories, mainly in the Shiite tradition. It is even related that after the Prophet had returned from his most sublime experience, the heavenly journey, or Isra and Miraj in the Islamic tradition, the next morning he had to borrow some barley from an unsympathetic merchant in order to assuage his hunger. Umar ibn al-Khattab, destined to become Muhammad's second successor, the second caliph, once wept when looking at the Prophet's miserable household, meaning their poverty. Upon being asked the reason for his tears, the Prophet said, "Why are you crying?" He replied that he could not bear the idea that Khosrow and Caesar, the rulers of Iran and Rome or Byzantium, lived in luxury while the Prophet of God was near starvation in his poverty. "They have this world, and we the next one," answered the Prophet, consoling him. Had not God offered him the keys of all treasures on earth? Yet he had refused them because he wanted to stay with his Lord, quote, "who feeds me and gives me to drink." Did not God want to make him a king prophet like David and Solomon, though he preferred to be a servant prophet? Quote, "I eat as a slave eats, and sit as a slave sits, for I am a slave of God." His prayer, which became a favorite with mystics and ascetics, was, "O Lord, keep me hungry one day, and satiated one day. When I am hungry, I pray to you, and when I am full, I sing your praise." These are all from hadith sources. And the sufferings inflicted upon him by the unfeeling Meccans resulted in his remark that, quote, "those most afflicted are the prophets, then the saints, and then the others according to their particular position." It is told that someone came to the Prophet and said, "I love you, O Messenger of God." To which he replied, "Well then, be ready for poverty." Hence, love of the poor became a sign of love for the Prophet. To honor the poor and to associate with them means not only to follow his example, but in a certain sense to honor him in them. One can think here of the Christian tradition where in the Bible Jesus is recorded as saying, "Whatsoever you have done for the least of these," meaning the least among you, the most vulnerable, the most poor, "that you have done unto me." And there are Islamic hadiths in the same exact spirit with very similar wording. The Prophet's admonition concerning the treatment of slaves, "Let them wear what you wear, and let them eat what you eat," was quite popular in later centuries, as several anecdotes prove. Regarding slavery, I would make the point that the Quran is the only religious text that I have ever come across which in certain instances explicitly commands the freeing of a slave, and in other instances recommends the practice as a basic fundamental good. There is no world scripture that explicitly called for the complete systematic abolition of slavery, because slavery, in the context of its time, was something that was ubiquitously present, as far as we know, all throughout recorded human history. So there's no religious text that I've ever found, to my knowledge, which does explicitly call for slavery to be abolished as such universally. However, I would point out that the Quran, again, in my view, alone of all religious scriptures, takes an implicitly negative view of slavery, And this is buttressed by the fact that the Quran says, for instance, if you see even a little bit of good in a slave and he asks you for freedom, grant it to him. In other words, if the slave could survive when being freed, it was very common, for instance, in ancient pre-Christian Rome, that people would free their slaves, knowing that they couldn't really depend fully on themselves yet, and so then they would take on their slaves, their former slaves, their freedmen, as clients in the intricate system of patron-client relations, so they would still get a lot of cheap labor from them. In contradistinction from this, the Quran is saying, if this person who asks you for freedom has the ability to survive and make it, you should give them that freedom, because human beings are fundamentally equal before God in their servanthood before God, and fundamentally, therefore, on the level of ontological reality of man as simply a human being, humans are equal in relation to each other. I could go on in this section. It's a beautiful one, but I'll just skip ahead just to give you a little bit of some of the different flavor, because this book is a tour de force throughout what I would call all of the Mohammedan dimensions of Islam, all of the different ways in which Muhammad is venerated by all sorts of different spiritual psychologies and groups within Islam. On one level, each Muslim relates to Muhammad in a unique personal way. There are no two Muslims who have the same exact mental construct in their mind or imagination of who Muhammad is. So in that sense, there are as many Muhammads as there are Muslims in the world. And yet on another level, there are certain common themes. So moving to chapter 7, the light of Muhammad and the mystical tradition. This refers to the idea of the Nur Muhammadiyya or Nur Muhammadi. And this is a very important idea that I'll only briefly mention here. For those of you who are not aware, this is a notion of logos theology within Islam, so similar to Christianity, which has a logos theology in which Christ is the central figure as the first and chief emanation from the divine, or emanation from the Father in Christian parlance. You see this in the Gospel of John. So in Islam, from an very early period in Islamic history, within the first 2 centuries after the death of the Prophet, we have recorded embryonic forms, which then develop much more in the following centuries, of the notion of this primordial light, which is equated with the pre-embodied personage or soul of Muhammad, through which God created the world ultimately. So very similar to the Christian notion of God creating the world through the pre-incarnate Christ, or the Word of God. One of the central themes, if not the central theme, of mystical prophetology in Islam is that the light of Muhammad, Nur Muhammad, is like the light of the sun around which everything revolves. It is that light of the name which Iqbal, as so many poets before him, mentions in his poetic verse. The idea has colored every literary expression of mystical Islam, and is also featured widely in folk Islam, so popular non-elite Islam, from early days to our own century. One of the most moving experiences a visitor to India or Pakistan can enjoy is a qawwali, a gathering, or mehfil, in which religious music is sung. The leading singer and the responding chorus slowly become excited more and more, and like many of their listeners, seem to reach a state of near ecstasy. Among the songs most frequently heard at such occasions is a Persian ghazal, or verse, ascribed to Amir Khusro, the medieval Indian poet, musician, and I would add saint, in the Chistiya order, the Sufi order in the subcontinent, to whom Hindustani music owes, if not its foundation, then at least a very momentous impetus. The poem begins, Namidanam che manzil bud shabghahi ki man budam. I do not know which place it was, the nightly place in which I was. And after speaking of the mysterious nocturnal celebration in which God himself appears as the cupbearer, the Saki in Persian verse, the poet closes with the surprising line, Muhammad Sham I Mahfil Bud. Muhammad was the candle there, the nightly place in which I was. The Prophet Muhammad is the candle of the assembly, Sham I Mahfil, the light, I'm on page 124, the light that illuminates the darkness of this world in which the listeners are gathered, the radiant candle around which human hearts throng like spellbound moths. Among all the attributes and descriptions that have been woven around the Prophet's person to cover him with luminous veils of praise, those that speak of him as belonging to the sphere of light are most common. Indeed, the Quran itself, in Surah 33, verse 46, as we saw, calls the Prophet Sirajun Munir, a shining lamp, an expression taken over by Hassan ibn Thabit, the great contemporary of the Prophet, who was a legendary Arab poet. By legendary, I mean incredible. His verse was beloved by all of the Arabs. He was a well-tested historical figure who once described Muhammad as the one who brought light and truth in the darkness, as in Surah 5:15, there came to you from God a light and a clear book. Furthermore, in the description of the Battle of Badr, Hassan claims that the Prophet's face shone like the full moon, Badr, and in his threnody for the venerated Prophet, he mentions also the radiant light that shone at Muhammad's birth, a topic repeated time and again in the literature. And he who is guided to the blessed light is well guided. This poetical statement looks like a prelude to the mystical interpretation of the light verse of the Quran as it was introduced by the theologian Muqattil in the 8th century. He seems to have been the first to interpret the words of this verse as referring to the Prophet. This is Surah 24, verse 35. This is called the Ayah an-Nur, the light verse. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The likeness of his light is as a niche wherein is a lamp, the lamp in a glass, the glass as if it were a glittering star, kindled from a blessed tree, an olive tree that is neither of the east nor of the west, whose oil well nigh would shine even if no fire touched it. Light upon light, this is in Arabic nurun ala nur, God guides to his light whom he will, and God strikes similitudes for man, and God has knowledge of everything. It is the lamp, Mizbah, that Muqattil sees as a fitting symbol for Muhammad. Through him the divine light could shine in the world, and through him mankind was guided to the origin of this light. The formula, neither of the east nor of the west, was then taken as a reference to Muhammad's comprehensive nature, which is not restricted to one specific people or race, and which surpasses the boundaries of time and space. To our day, one of the most common epithets of the Prophet is Nur al-Huda, light of right guidance. Did not Muhammad himself mention the light that penetrated him in one of his prayers, a prayer that has belonged to the most precious treasures of the faithful Muslims for century after century? This is a prayer that many Muslims will themselves pray, a dua, a supplication, throughout the year, especially though during Ramadan, among the nights that are hoped to be Laylatul Qadr, the night of decree, or the night of radiance, on which, in the majoritarian tradition of Islam, the Quran was sent down in Ramadan. So this is the holiest night of the year for most Muslims, in which they try to offer heightened prayer in communion with God. This dua, this supplicatory prayer of the Prophet, is as follows. O God, place light in my heart, and light in my soul, light upon my tongue, light in my eyes, and light in my ears. Place light at my right, light at my left, light behind me, and light before me, light above me, and light beneath me. Place light in my nerves, and light in my flesh, light in my blood, light in my hair, and light in my skin. Give me light, increase my light, make me light. For those of a Christian tradition, this is immediately similar in form to the Lorica prayer attributed to St. Patrick, the Romano-British saint who, of course, famously converted Ireland from Druidic polytheism to, in certain areas, Christianity. But the poem, of course, is the poem prayer, it's very poetic, is truly a very beautiful one. What, of course, Patrick's prayer does not hold is the implication and the imploring of God to make me light. Theories concerning Muhammad's luminous character began to develop on the basis of Muqatil's exegesis in the second half of the 9th century. It was an Iraqi Sufi, Sal al-Tustari, who died in 896 of the Common Era, who first expressed the entire Hayazgashitya in the terminology of the light of Muhammad, and he too derived his ideas from the light verse. As his modern interpreter, Gerard Bowring writes in his fundamental study of the Prophet's role in Tustari's theology the following: God in his absolute oneness and transcendent reality is affirmed by Tustari as the inaccessible mystery of divine light, which yet articulates itself in the pre-eternal manifestation of the likeness of his light, Mathalu Nurihi, that is, the likeness of the light of Muhammad, Nur Muhammad. The origin of the Nur Muhammad in pre-eternity is depicted as a luminous mass of primordial adoration in the presence of God, which takes the shape of a transparent column, Amud, of divine light, and constitutes Muhammad as the primal creation, the first creation or emanation of God. Thus explaining the terminology of the light verse, Tustari says, when God willed to create Muhammad, he made appear a light from his light. When it reached the veil of the majesty, Hijab al-Azama, it bowed in prostration before God. God created from its prostration a mighty column like crystal glass of light that is outwardly and inwardly translucent. Interestingly, Tustari also connects Surah 53 with the light of Muhammad. He does not interpret this surah either as pertaining to the Prophet's initial vision or to his heavenly journey, but claims instead that the words, quote, and he saw him, meaning God, and he saw him still another time, this is Surah 53, verse 13 of the Quran, mean at the beginning of time, when the column of the light of Muhammad was standing, metaphysically, before God. Quote, before the beginning of creation by 1,000,000 years, he stood before him in worship, ubudiyya, which means servanthood and worship, with the disposition of faith, and to him, meaning to the Prophet, before he was in human form, so the soul of Muhammad, and to him was unveiled the mystery by capital M, mystery itself, at the lote tree of the boundary. He's referring here to Surah 53, verse 14. That is the tree at which the knowledge of everyone comes to an end. Then when creation began, God, quote, created Adam from the light of Muhammad. Quoting again from Tustari here, or Bowring's rather analysis of Tustari, the light of the prophets is from his, Muhammad's light, and the light of the heavenly kingdom, Malakut, is from his light, and the light of this world and of the world to come is from his light. Bowring continues with his interpretation of Tustari's doctrine. Finally, when the emanation of the prophets and the spiritual universe in pre-eternity was completed, Muhammad was shaped in the body, in his temporal and terrestrial form, from the clay of Adam, which, however, had been taken from the pre-eternal column of Nur Muhammad. Thus the pre-eternal creation of light was perfected. The primal man was molded from the crystallized light of Muhammad and took the corporate personality of Adam. That means, as Ibn Arabi was to state 3 centuries after Tustari, that the Prophet is, quote, like the seed, bidr, of the human race, and the poets have never tired of alluding to the paradox that Muhammad is prior to Adam in essence, though outwardly his descendant. Tostari's high-soaring speculations, which were to influence a large current in Sufi thought, were elaborated more poetically by his disciple Halaj, who says in Tasin as-Siraj, Tasin of the Lamp, the first chapter of his Kitab at-Tawasin, quote, "He," meaning the Prophet Muhammad, "he was a lamp from the light of the invisible, a moon radiating among the moons, whose mansion is in the sphere of mysteries. The divine truth, God, called him Ummi, unlettered or unworded, because of the collectedness of his noble aspiration, Himma. The lights of prophethood, from his light did they spring forth," meaning from the Prophet's light, from Muhammad's primordial light, "and their lights appeared from his light, and there is no light among the lights more luminous and more visible and previous to pre-existent than the light of this noble one." One must keep in mind, Schimmel continues, that these words were written less than 300 years after the Prophet's death. From this time, the luminous Prophet appears everywhere in mystical and poetical works. He himself is credited with statements pertaining to his sublime rank. So the Prophet himself, there are hadiths in which he seems to describe his divine, or rather his proximity to God, his humanity in form, in physical human form, but his otherwise utterly incomparable rank among human beings. For instance, "The first thing that God created was my light," and his remark, "My companions are like the stars," in the Sunni Hadith corpus, fits well with his role as the central sun, or the full moon, of Islam. Halaj's friend, the somewhat eccentric Shibli, recited on his deathbed a verse that is still sung in qawwalis throughout India and Pakistan. "Any house in which you dwell does not need any lamps, and on the day when proofs are brought, then my proof is your face." So he's referring again to the hadiths in which the Prophet has an unusually luminous, radiant face. Even though this verse may not originally have been meant as a eulogy for the Prophet, it is telling that it has since been understood as an allusion to the Prophet's radiant face. Again, Ibn Arabi is largely responsible for the central role of this light in later Sufism. The first light appears out of the veil of the unseen, and from knowledge to concrete existence, it is the light of our Prophet Muhammad, he states in his profession of faith, and he goes on to compare Muhammad, the Siraj Munir, to the sun, inferring from this that, quote, "the intelligences, uqul, the spirits, arwah, the intuitions, basair, and the essences, dhawat, are nourished by the luminous essence of Mustafa the elect, who is the sun, S-U-N, of existence." The ideas of Ibn Arabi and his interpreter, Abdul Karim al-Jili, underlie a great many remarks in poetry throughout the Muslim world, in which the Prophet is described in terms that sometimes sound surprising, if not shocking, to the outsider. Jili speaks, for instance, of the haqiqat al-haqa'iq, the innermost reality, or the truth among the truths, you can interpret it several ways, which is indeed the haqiqa Muhammadiyya, the Muhammadan reality, capital M, capital R, and which appears in pre-eternity as a white chrysolite, yaquta ba'ida. God looks at it, and it dissolves into waves and other watery substances, out of which the created world emerges. But this tradition was much older. Thalabi, in his Arais al-Bayan, written shortly after the year 1000 of the Common Era, so less than 400 years after the death of the Prophet, knew a colorful myth in which a radiant pearl plays a central role. The mystics before Ibn Arabi have lovingly used Tustari's vision of the pre-eternal column of light, and few passages in medieval Persian poetry convey a more impressive picture than Attar's lines in the introduction of the Mantiq al-Tayr. This is his work, The Assembly of the Birds, or The Conference of the Birds, one of the most beautiful Persian epics from the, I believe, 12th century or 13th century. "What first appeared from out the unseen's depth." This book is truly a masterpiece, and I can't help but want to go further in, but for that I would recommend getting the book yourself. It's in many libraries throughout the English-speaking Muslim world. Any university library would definitely have it. You can also find a PDF of it, but I would strongly recommend purchasing the text if you have the means to do so. Regardless of where you fall within the Islamic world in terms of your theology or beliefs, or for non-Muslims who are academic specialists or interested in Islam, it's a text that is immensely rewarding. There are other chapters on the night journey and ascension of the Prophet, which itself became the most enduring and important part of the Islamic mystical tradition. There's an entire section on poetry in honor of the Prophet in Arabic, and then in Persian and Turkish. There is a chapter on the Muhammadan path, so how to follow his sunnah most beautifully. Then, of course, there's a chapter on the Muhammad of the Sufis, so Muhammad as understood by those who craved a deeper sense of spiritual union with God in this life. For them, he is, of course, the chief fount, the chief exemplar in all things on that path of wayfaring or suluk to God in this life. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe, and until next time, thanks.